this is Mr. G. Today we're going to talk about note value specifically. We're going to concentrate on that, but we're going to touch on a couple of other subjects. We're going to talk a little bit about measures, and we're going to talk a little bit about time signatures. Not a lot. We're not going to go down too far down that rabbit hole just yet. That'll be for another lesson. But they're all tied together: measures, time signatures, and note values. So having said that, let's get right into our lesson. All right, what we see here is a hierarchy of notes in the musical world that we live in. The top note looks like an oval. It's a whole note. It's called a whole note because in the very beginning, it took up a whole measure. You notice that there's two half notes. That means one half note is half as long as a whole note. That's why they call it a half note. There's four quarter notes. That means one quarter note is 1/4 as long as a whole note, called a quarter note. 8 notes, there's 8 of them. That's because one of them is 1/8 as long as a whole note. Same with the 16th. The 16th notes, there's 16 of them because one of them is 1/16 as long as a whole note. Everything references to the whole notes. Now, it's an easy hierarchy to remember. 2 half notes equal a whole. 2 quarter notes equal a half. 2 eighths equal a quarter, and 2 sixteenths equal an eighth. That's where all our rhythm studies begin, understanding these relationships. All right, let's take a closer look at what a measure is and what time signatures tell us. If you look at a song as a house, then measures are the rooms in that house, and you can only fit so many people in that room. And that's where the time signature comes in, because it tells you how many notes can live in that room. Or you can look at each measure as if it's a suitcase. And you can only fit so much in a suitcase. How much can you put in that suitcase? This time signature tells us. So the measures are denoted by the vertical lines separating all the notes. And the time signature, we're only going to look at the top number. You notice there's 2 numbers. In this example here, the 4/4. We're only going to look at the top number. The top number tells you how many beats can fit in every measure. You have to have that many beats in every measure. Perhaps the best way, though, to demonstrate why we need these things is this graphic. Look at this melody. This melody has no measures. It has no time signatures. It's just a long string of notes. But now look at the same graphic when we apply a 4/4 time signature to it, and we put measures in there. And we put a measure, a vertical line, every 4 beats. Boom. Doesn't that clean up? Now, as a musician, I can look at this and I can see the phrases, I can see the note divisions, I can see the beat divisions. It makes it very easy to read. So time signatures and measures really take a confusing mess of notes and make it more easy for us to read. I'm sure that's improper grammar, but you know what I'm talking about, right? Let's take a little closer look at this cleaned up measure so you can see how measures and beats are working for us. You notice all the way over to the one side, there is a treble clef. That's that funny looking curly thing, all the way to the left. And next to it, you see 2 numbers, a 4/4. We're only going to concern ourselves with the top number right now. That top number says this is how many beats per measure there are supposed to be. Now, these 4 beats, which is what each measure can have in this piece of music, can be a combination of any of our notes that we've learned about at the beginning of this lesson. So for instance, take a look at measure 1. Do you see the 4 beats there? 4 quarter notes? Now take a look at measures 2 and measures 3. See if you can see where the 4 beats are hiding. Remember, a quarter note is worth 1 beat. And 2 eighth notes equal a quarter note. So 2 eighth notes are equal to 1 beat. 2 16th notes, that's equal to 1 eighth note. So if you have an eighth note and 2 16th notes, that's a beat. And then 4 16ths equals a beat. Can you see why measures and time signatures really help us out? We're going to get more into those later, but I just wanted to touch on these subjects a little bit to kind of prime the pump a little bit for the next lesson. All right? Fantastic. Mr. G out. Bye-bye. Hey, this is Mr. G. Welcome back. Lesson 2 in our rhythm series. Last lesson we talked about note values, we talked a little bit about measures, and we talked about what the top number of the time signature means. 4/4, there's how many beats per measure? Correct, 4. 3/4, how many beats per measure? 3. 2/4, 2 beats per measure. 6/8, how many beats per measure? 6. So you see how that works. Well, this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit more about what that bottom number means, and that's a really important number. When you see a bottom number, it tells you what type of note gets 1 beat. If there's 4 counts to a measure or 4 beats to a measure, then what note gets 1 beat so that we can figure out how to count this measure out? Let's take a look at 4/4. Top number, 4 beats per measure. The bottom number, 4, means a quarter note gets 1 beat. If it helps you, replace that top number with the number 1, just ever so briefly in your brain. And you see a fraction before you, 1/4, 1/4, a quarter note. If the bottom number is an 8, like in 6/8, 9/8, or 12/8, ever so briefly, replace that top number with a 1, and you end up with a fraction, 1/8, or an 1/8. 1/8 note gets a beat. If it's a 2, that's a valid time signature. For instance, as in 2/2. Replace that top number with a 1, and you end up with a fraction, 1/2, or 1/2. Half note gets 1 beat. Now, the bottom number, in conjunction with the top number, defines what can go in a measure. Does that make sense? So if it's 4/4, 4 beats in a measure, quarter note gets 1 beat. Any combination of notes that equal up to 4 beats can take place in that measure. And remember, we talked about a measure being like a suitcase. You can only put so many clothes in a suitcase. Or it's like a room in a house. There can only be so many people in a house, or in a room in the house. So the top number, how many beats per measure? The bottom number, what kind of note gets 1 beat? And that's our reference point for filling up the house or the suitcase with notes. Now, one thing, these time signatures split into 2 groups. Remember how I mentioned at the very beginning how music basically is separated into 2 camps, pitch and rhythm? Well, the rhythm world is split into 2 camps. Now, music theorists have a fancy name for it, but I just call it groups of 2s, groups of 3s. Here's how it works. Whenever the top number of your time signature is only divisible by itself and 2, it's called a group. It's in that group called a group of 2. If the top number can be divisible by 3, it belongs to the group of 3. Now, the difference between the 2 is pretty easy to discern. Groups of 2, that will be 2/4, 4/4, 2/2. It's a straight up and down rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. It's very straight up and down. I won't say square, but kind of. And one of the distinctive characteristics of it is that you tend to see 1/8 notes grouped in pairs, group of 2. 2 1/8 notes together with a bar over the top. Sometimes they'll connect 2 pairs of these 2 1/8 notes, and you see 4 1/8 notes with a bar across the top. But one of the characteristics of groups of 2 is that you expect to see 1/8 notes with the bar across the top. Groups of 2. Groups of 3, well, that's like all these have a feeling like a waltz. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now it could be fast. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1. It could be slow. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But they all tend to have this danceable, lilting feel to it. And it's called groups of 3, to me anyway, because most of these time signatures you will expect to see, and you probably will see it sometime, eighth notes, when they're grouped together, will be grouped in threes. 3 eighth notes with a bar across the top. It's very common in 6/8, 9/8, and 12/8. So you'll see 3 eighth notes connected together in a group. Now in 3/4, it's a little different because you'll see the equivalent of 3/4 notes. It's still the same thing. You're going to see 3/4 notes as the overriding feel for that measure. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, etc. All right, so does that make sense? Groups of twos, 2/4, 2/2, 4/4. Groups of threes, 3/4, 6/8, 9/8, 12/8. Groups of twos, top numbers divisible by itself and 2. Groups of threes, the top numbers divisible by 3. Groups of threes have a waltz type feel. Groups of twos have a straight up and down feel. Does that make sense? We're going to talk about rests to begin with. Do you remember the note pyramid that we had in our first lesson? Well, there's an equivalent rest for each one of those notes. Whole note, meet whole rest. Half note, meet half rest. Quarter note, equal quarter rest. Eighth note, eighth rest. 16th note, 16th rest. So every note has an equivalent rest attached to it. And we count the rest just like we do a note. Now, the difference between rest and note is obvious. The note is something you hear. The rest is something you don't hear. We rest. All right. Hey, I've got a moment between students here on a lesson day. I just want to jump in here real quick and give a couple of examples to demonstrate what we just talked about, where I just told you notes are what we hear, rests are what we don't hear. I've got a measure of 4/4. Now remember, 4/4s, 4 beats to the measure. The quarter note gets 1 beat. So there's going to be 4 quarter notes in this measure. So if we count that out, you do it 1, 2, 3, 4. Make sense? Now I'm going to replace one of those quarter notes with, say, a quarter rest. Let's take beat 3, the note on beat 3, and exchange it for a rest. Now we count it out like this. 1, 2, 4. 1, 2, 4. Now I have my elementary students, when they're clapping like this, I'll go 1, 2, hold your hands together and move it. But don't say anything for the beat that's got a rest. So this would be 1, 2, 4. What if we took that rest and put it on beat 2? Then we have a note on beat 1, rest on 2, but a note on 3 and 4. So now it would be 1, 3, 4. Now you don't have to do the little hand thing if you don't want to, but sometimes it's a way to get physically involved with the rest. You can't make any noise. So if you make a motion, it just reinforces this whole rest principle. So it would be like 1, 3, 4. You could say the word rest if you want. 1, rest, 3, 4. When I'm playing guitar or bass, I won't say rest. Sometimes I'll grunt. Gets me some odd looks, but it helps. Again, it's a way of getting physically involved with the music. 1, 3, 4. What if I took the rest and put it on beat 4? Now we have beats 1, 2, and 3 with a note, 4 without one. A rest, right? So it'd be like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, Now let's take a look at some eighth notes. Here's a measure with eighth notes. Now, if you fill up a measure of 4/4 eighth notes, you have 8 eighth notes, 4 pairs of eighth notes, if you will. And if you look at it, you'll see 4 groups of eighth note pairs, right? And you count the first note of each eighth note pair as the number of that beat, 1. And the second note of the pair is and. So it's 1 and, 1 and, right? So a full measure of eighth notes, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. We do the same thing with eighth rest that we do with the quarter rest. Let me replace one. Let me replace the downbeat of beat 2 with an eighth rest. In other words, I'm going to go to beat 2, which is going to be your third note in. 1 and 2. Replace that one with an eighth rest. So now it's going to go 1 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 3 and 4 and. If I'm going to do my grunt thing, it'll be 1 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 3 and. Or I'll just say the word rest. 1 and rest and 3 and 4 and. See how that works? We can move that eighth rest all over the place. Let's replace beat 4, the downbeat of beat 4 with an eighth rest. So now we have 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and. Right? See how that works? Cool. All right, well, that's what I mean by you hear notes, you don't hear rests. And now I've shown you a little bit about eighth rest and quarter rest. We'll be doing some more exercises later on, but I just wanted to break that out to you. All right? Let's get back to the video. Mr. G out. Now there's a couple little tricks that I used years ago to determine what kind of rest is what. If you notice that the whole rest and the half rest look similar, I used to think of the whole rest as a hole in the road. And the half rest, well, kind of looks like a hat. So that's the correlation I made. When we get to the quarter rest, from here on, there's not a lot of examples I can draw on to help you remember them. I just know the quarter rest is a squiggle. I used to think that perhaps it was a silhouette of Jay Leno and his famous chin, but if you don't know who Jay Leno is, that means nothing to you. I also noticed that the eighth rest looks like a 7 with a little blobby ball thing at the end. I don't know why they did that. I honestly don't know. I don't know why an eighth rest looks like a 7. But they did add an extra flag onto it to make the eighth rest look like a 16th rest. So that's kind of like the way the notes work. But some things you're just going to have to remember. Whole note, meet whole rest. Half note, meet half rest. Quarter note, equal quarter rest. Eighth note, eighth rest. 16th note, 16th rest. All right, Mr. G here. Got my tea, ready to go. We're going to look at Banjo Ben's song Arkansas Traveler, the basic version, and I'm going to demonstrate how I learn a piece, and I'm going to count my way through it, and I'm going to give you just a look into my process about how I learn a brand new tune. Now, I subscribe to a really simple process. It's listen, sing, then play. Listen, sing, and play. Or listen, sing, and count. So what I do is I listen to Banjo Ben's Arkansas Traveler. I'm not going to do that now. It's on his site. Pull it up, have a listen. But I got the point where I could sing along with the basic melody, the melody that you see here. Now, I have his tablature with standard notation so that you can see how both relate with each other. And the standard notation helps me demonstrate more clearly how I count this stuff out. So, first of all, what I do is I just start my groove. This is my tempo. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now you notice this song is in 4/4, so there's 4 beats to the measure. That means quarter note gets 1 beat, 1, 2, 3, 4. Eighth notes are on the upbeat or in between, and so you count it 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now I do this instead of using a metronome when I'm learning a tune. Primary reason is it allows me to become physically involved with the song I'm listening to, which helps in the learning process. The more ways you have of getting information into your brain, the more firmly entranced that song is. So, I've listened to it. Now I'm just going to sing it. Here's my tempo. I'll just do this without the eighth notes. Da 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 dun 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 da 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 dun dun da 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 dun 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 da 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 dun. Not perfect pitch-wise, but you get the idea, right? So I'm able to sing it with the tempo. Now, then what I do is I'll go in and look at the music, and I'm going to take a little piece, a pencil or something, and I'm going to write my count notes underneath it. We know that eighth notes in pairs are 1 and 2 and, right? So I'm going to go in the very first measure, 1 and 2 and 3, 4. Quarter notes get one beat. Second measure, 1, 2, and then there's a note on beat 3, but it's a half note. 3, 4 is quiet. You don't do anything on 4. Next measure, 1, 2, 3, 4. Fourth measure, last measure on the top line, 1 and 2 and 3, 4. Go to the second line, 1 and 2 and 3, 4. Next measure, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then I go to the next measure, 1, 2, 3 and 4 and then the last measure, 1 and 2 and 3, 4. Now I got my notes underneath it. Now I'm going to go back and sing it. This time I'm going to sing it using my notes, about the notes. It'll be like this. Here's my tempo. 1, 2, here's my eighth notes. 1 and 2. Here we go. Ready? 1 and 2 and 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 and 2 and 3, 4. 1 and 2 and 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3. Got a little bit high there for me at the end. But that's what I do. And this is my metronome. Now you can use a metronome if you wish. I prefer to do this initially while I'm learning to count the song out before I ever pick my guitar up to play it. Now, once that happens, I can count it. I've got the rhythms figured out. I can sing it. And then it really shortens up the learning process when it comes to picking up my instrument and playing. All right, Mr. G here. We're going to start looking at tied notes and dotted notes in this lesson. Do you remember the time signature lesson where we talked about what 4/4 was? 4 over 4? Well, that bottom note means there's 4 beats per measure, correct? Cool. That means we can have any kind of notes we want in those measures as long as they add up to no more and no less than 4 beats. We can have rests and we can have notes. For instance, a whole note. 4 beats. We have 1 whole note per measure. We can have 2 half notes. That equals 4 beats. We could have 4 quarter notes. That equals 4 beats. We could have 8 eighth notes. That equals 4 beats. Or we could combine them. I could have a half note plus 2 quarters. I could have a half note, a quarter note, and 2 eighth notes. Any combinations of notes as long as they add up to 4. Cool. But what if I wanted a note to last longer than 4 beats or 2 beats or 1 beat? What if I wanted that whole note to last for 5 beats? What do I do then? What if I want a half note to last longer than 2 beats? What if I wanted a half note to equal 3 beats? What if I wanted a quarter note to equal 1.5 beats instead of 1 beat? What do I do? This is where the ties come in and the dots. Let's look at the ties first. When you tie one note to another note, you create one new longer note. For instance, if I said I wanted a whole note to last for 5 beats instead of 4, I would tie some note to it. Well, whole note has 4 beats. What note has 1 beat that we could tie to it? Well, a quarter note has 1 beat. All right, well, let's put a quarter note next to it, and we just put a little tie to it. Now, that whole note lasts 5 beats. Without the tie, it would sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. But now with the tie, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Well, half note. I want a half note to equal 3 beats. What do I do? Well, I need to add a note to that 2-beat note, the half note. What note do I have to add to a half note to make it worth 3 beats? A quarter note, because 2 plus 1 equals 3. So without the tie, if I had a measure that consisted of a half note and 2 quarter notes, it would sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. But if I tie that half note to that first quarter note, now that half note goes for 3 beats, leaves a quarter note by itself at the end. So it's going to sound like 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Cool, huh? Now, take a quarter note. If I had a measure that consists of a quarter note and 2/8 notes, a quarter note and 2/8 notes, but I wanted one of those quarter notes to last 1.5 beats instead of just 1. Well, guess what? I would tie it to one of these 8th notes. Without the tie, it would sound like this. 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, 2, and 3, 4, and. Now I'm going to tie the first 8th note to that quarter note, first quarter note. Now it's going to sound like this. 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, 2, and 3, 4, and. So there's our ties. So we can make a note last as long as we want by just tying any other note to it. This takes us to the next subject, dots. Well, how do you use a dotted note? Or what is a dotted note? Well, a dot kind of does the same thing as a tie. It's a little bit more limited, but you see it a lot in music. If you add a dot next to a note, you're increasing that note by half of its value. Okay, what's half of a value of a half note, for instance? A quarter note. So if I put a dot next to a half note, that's as if I tied a half note and a quarter note together. It lasts 3 beats. If I want a quarter note to last, and I put a dot next to that quarter note, it lasts the value of that quarter note plus half of a quarter note. What's half of a quarter note? Oh yeah, an 8th note. It's the same, a dotted quarter note is the same as if a quarter note and an 8th note were tied together. So again, if I saw a measure of a half note and 2 quarter notes, followed by quarter note 2/8, quarter note 2/8, but I dotted that very first half note, that leaves me with a single quarter note at the end of that measure because I can only have 4. And if I dot the quarter note, it takes away the first 8th note. So now this is what it looks like. Here's what it sounds like. First, the half note measure. It used to be 1, 2, 3, 4. Now it's 1, 2, 3, 4. The quarter note measure before the tie, before the dot rather, was 1, 2, and 3, 4, and. Now with the dot, it's like 1, 2, and 3, 4, and. We're going to be discussing 3/4. A lot of the principles, in fact, all of the principles of counting in 4/4, which we've already discussed, are the same as for counting in 3/4 with one little difference. In 3/4, there's only 3 beats per measure. If you look at 4/4 and 3/4 next to each other, the top number is different. 4/4, the top number is 4. We get 4 beats per measure. 3/4, the top number is 3. We get 3 beats per measure. So we're just going to look at a couple examples of songs that show counting in 3/4. And you'll see that everything we've learned up until this point fits perfectly into 3/4. But there's only one thing different. It's only 3 beats per measure instead of 4. You're going to see one of the first things right off is why we needed a dotted half note. Because there's only 3 beats in a measure of 3/4, a whole note won't fit. It's too big. So we needed a note that would fill up that space in that measure, and guess what? A dotted half note fits the bill. Now, there are lots of songs in 3/4 that I know you're familiar with. Star Spangled Banner, Amazing Grace, Greensleeves can be done in 3/4. Silent Night can be done in 3/4. So, oh yeah, and one of my favorites, Tennessee Waltz. I love that song. Well, we're going to look at a couple of these examples, Silent Night and a little bit from Tennessee Waltz, just to show you how things work in 3/4, and you're going to see it's quite simple, just like we did in our last lesson. All right, let's take a look at Silent Night first. All right, we know this melody, right? Silent night, holy night. Counting it out, look at the dotted quarter and eighth. 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, 3. Simple, right? Now I'm going to bring up an example of Tennessee Waltz. And in this one, you're going to see something really, really cool. You're going to see an example of a tied note. And again, same thing, dotted notes. But it's a really pretty melody, and it's a good example that demonstrates everything we talked about in the last lesson. You can see in this measure right here, there's the dotted quarter and an eighth. You would count this measure, 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2. And we have a dotted quarter here. And down here we have a dotted half note tied across the measure line or the bar line to another half note because he wanted to hold this note out 5 beats. Now I'm going to play it and then I'm going to count through it as the notes are going by, so you can see how we would count in 3/4. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. All right, see how that works? Cool. Happy picking, y'all. Mr. G out. Bye-bye.